Well, Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to once again join you and we can learn together. It has been an interesting journey thus far in the counting of the Omer. I'll explain some more of that today. However, first I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of the bride, okay? So we're going to jump just straight into this. The best way I can put this to you is that when you are looking at a Hebrew wedding, there's a number of very important elements present. The first is, and this is very important, and this is not a this is not a it's not an American Christian perspective. And it is definitely not a progressive perspective. Short version of this is that a deal is made between a father and a father. The children don't have a whole lot of say in it. The purpose behind the marriage is not for them to be necessarily in love, but a decision is made by those in authority who have more experience and more wisdom about whether or not these two would work good together, and a matchmaker who supposedly has the gift of understanding this. Okay, so it's a very different cultural perspective, and if you want to call it chauvinistic or whatever, I would caution you that a majority of the matchmakers were a feminine principle. In other words, they were female. It is very, very important for you to also know that this was a joyful and acceptable practice. Now, that being said, let's talk about the ramifications. A man and a woman are put together whether they liked each other or not. Do we have any reference? Do we have any frame of references where this would be true? Adam and Eve, right? Put together by a shadchan, or a matchmaker, that being Yahweh Elohim, right? Okay, now, why would this be important? Well, because when we are dealing with the connection between the intensification of all power in the universe, which is a non-perceivable version of the Creator. Non-perceivable being what? We cannot say anything else to define it. It is an intelligent, conscious energy who thinks things into existence. Okay? That's the best we could do. Now, if we were to cross down into more visible attributes that are apparent in the Bible, we can see that there is an attribute throughout that is a long-suffering, or waiting, or not engaging in the foolishness of humans as a result of an impatience. What I mean by that is that as we start to define God, we start to add elements like Him to the process, or we add father to the process, or husband to the process. We are anthropomorphizing the energies that are not definable into something definable, and thereby creating limitations upon them. Now, the reason why this is important is because as those limitations start to come upon the Creator of the universe, we begin to have to define it, right? We begin to have to explain it. Well, in that process, of course, then we are starting to encounter what? A dummying down of that intensification that nothing can exist in. Nothing can exist there. Okay. So the next thought that we need to get into then is, if we are going to go ahead and define God, and when I say God, I mean like the God of Christianity, in a term of husband, which consequently doubles as the term master, which we won't necessarily get into today. But if we do that, then we need to actually define the bride, okay? So if we accept that this energy of husband is part of the interaction between humans, then we need to kind of define or explain what it means to be a bride of a god, okay? Now we could get weird and we could get into Olympian theology where Zeus just kind of gets bored and goes and knocks up a female human. Or we could go Enochian and say that the book of Enoch says that angels came down and slept with daughters of men. You know, we could do all those things, but the truth be told is that that's not really how and why we would define a bride the way that we would. There are two very important variables. One, who is the bridegroom? And if the bridegroom has always been the same entity, who is the Shadchan? And if the Shadchan has always been the same entity, then that means that whatever bringing together occurs is part of a grander scheme and plan that we don't understand. And somewhere along the lines, we're going to have to reconcile the energies back to the intensification of all power in the universe. So let's get on the board and let's talk a minute about the three parts, okay? So the first part is going to be what we call the Shidduchim. Okay? The second part is called the Erusin. I spelled that backwards. And the final part is called the Nesasim. Maybe that's how it's spelled. So we can define this in English terms as, and let's go ahead and change color so that we can retain our learnings here. Shidduchim is matchmaking. Okay? It is seen. Here, we'll balance this out here. My mind will never let it be. Okay. Erosin is betrothal. Okay? And the Nesasim is the ratification. Of the covenant. Okay, so first things that we need to discuss is that there would be some sort of terms discussed between the two fathers, okay? So a couple things that you need to know is, first of all, the father of the bride is always considered in the marriage covenant the lesser because he will be losing his element from the family, right? So when we term lesser, we're not talking about diminished in quality or in value, but instead diminished in the sense that the one who is taking a loss is the one who needs to be protected. And therefore, some sort of term is discussed in how he is going to be compensated for the loss of the family member. But furthermore, because his daughter is about to be taken from his arms, possibly never to return to that family. You need to understand that once a woman was removed from the family and placed into the new family, she loses her name. She loses her willfulness that she had as a sovereignty as a child. Remember the daughters of Zelophehad. Loses her willfulness, right? And she also loses her freedom in the sense that she now comes under the covering of her husband. Now, it's not freedom in the sense of her being able to do things, because when we look into Proverbs chapter 31, we find that this woman is not only an entrepreneur, but a real estate, right? Monger. I mean, all of the things that you would not expect a woman to be doing, she's doing. She's creating textiles and trading and selling them with merchants. She's actually buying land and building upon it and investing in the business of it. This is not some staying at home barefoot and pregnant, making a sandwich when I get home. This is an entity of much power and much authority. And so don't think when I speak lesser or say lesser that that's what I'm saying. In fact, I will propose to you that some of the ignorance that I am trying to dissuade here is part of your problem in your marriage. And I propose to you that had this gone naturally the way that it is supposed to through the matchmaking process, and had this gone through the dowry process, there would be a lot more value to your spouse on both sides of the puzzle, whether you're male or female. Now, there are a couple of very important elements that I want to bring in here. The first is that you need to understand that the matchmaking is not the will of the daughter or the will of the son, but is the will of the father, which means there's two fathers, a greater father and a lesser father. If you really want to understand that mystery, you have to understand the difference between the higher and the lower Elohims that are within the oneness of God. Okay? That being the difference between human effort versus divine intervention, which we could potentially get into today, but I don't know if we're going to. Now, the reason why the Shidduchim part or the matchmaking part is so important is because that part does not require much from the bride except that which has gotten her the attention in the first place. Remember, I taught a long time ago that right now there is a false bride drawing the gaze, right? So there is a gaze of God looking into the cosmos and seeing a bride who appears to demonstrate all the qualities of a bride, right? And that it is the responsibility of the one true bride to re-establish his gaze. Because why? He took his eyes off of her because she had violated the betrothal, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is because when a woman desires to be taken as a wife, she needs to draw the gaze of the man, and then the man will go to the father and say, I like that one. And of course, the father will say, I don't know if I like that one. He will consult with the matchmaker and ask if the personalities match or don't match or what, right? In other words, it was more of a community effort to get two people married than it was two people secretly falling in love, secretly becoming intimate, and secretly connecting themselves. Now, there are exceptions to that, and Adam and Eve is one. I have encountered many relationships that were absolutely successful, covalent bond relationships that were established by God in a bedroom between those two people. Okay? And they come to me and they say, oh, I've done this sin. I slept with this woman before we were married, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, you don't understand. When you slept with her, you became married, right? At that moment, you made the decision to spend the rest of your life with that woman. Okay. So they come to me and they say, I'm guilty of sin, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what sin? Show me the sin. All it says is that if you catch a woman and seduce her and you two sleep together, that you're to give the father a dowry because it's already done. So anyways, the reason why I bring this up is because a woman has to draw the gaze of the man to begin with. Now, the way that she goes about doing that, there's a number of actual neurolinguistic cues that are available to a man, but generally speaking, she will make herself vulnerable and expose herself, right? She will lift her hair up and show her neck and her veins and things like that to show her arteries, right? She will often raise her arm, right, to show this artery. Now, what's interesting about that is if a man does that, then he's actually demonstrating that he's not afraid of you and you might have a fight on your hands. But if a woman does that, most likely she is actually trying to draw your gaze. She may not even realize that she's trying to draw your gaze because her instincts and her brain and all of the things that are programmed to do what she does, which is what? Preserve the species, may have already identified attributes in you that are demonstrative of what she wants her offspring to be. But what's important is she has to draw his gaze. So there's a number of things that are important here. The first one is that means that preparation is necessary. And we will explain that in a minute. But preparation being necessary means that a woman invariably needs to identify in herself the blemishes that she has in order to try to augment them or try to boost the beauties that she has so that he doesn't look upon her faults but looks upon her strengths, right? Okay, so invariably, there is an energy of matchmaking that says, here's the positive attributes of the bride. Yes, I see the negative ones, but here's the positive attributes of the bride, right? Okay. Now, the reason this is important is because somewhere along the lines, there's an examination that needs to occur, okay? Now, one of the mistakes that people make is to think that when a woman looks into a mirror, that she is actually demonstrating the intention of identifying her blemishes. And perhaps that's true, but truly when a woman looks in the mirror, she's preparing herself, accenting her beauty to demonstrate to whoever it is that looks upon her that she is beautiful, okay? Now, like I said, there are exceptions to this. There are people who are still living in their wounds who look upon themselves in the mirror and identify something hideous. They say, oh, that is horrible. I'm not going to look anymore. But truth be told is that the mirror is reflecting something that they should be looking upon and identifying with, okay? Now, I'll explain that more in a minute. All right. So the next step that we need to do then is talk a little bit about the betrothal in order to understand the matchmaking a little better. And we also need to talk about the ratification in order to understand the betrothal a little better. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to enter a season before it's time and talk about the ratification first. And now you're going to find that entering a season before it's time is a very powerful subject. And we're going to explain that a little bit further in the we're going to explain that a little bit further in the future of this discussion, okay? All right, so first and foremost, let's go ahead and understand covenant versus contract, okay? In a contract, there's a party in the first part and a party in the second part, or maybe a party in multiple parts, but however it works out, the party in the first part makes some sort of consideration or gives something in consideration of a property or a service that they are going to receive from the party in the second part. The consideration is something that will compensate for whatever the service or the property that is being transferred, okay? If either party is in breach of that, if the one party doesn't deliver the service to the satisfaction of the party in the first part, or if the one party does not deliver the property or product in satisfaction of the party in the first part, then that's a breach of contract. Furthermore, if the party in the first part does not deliver the compensation or the consideration, then the party in the first part is in breach of contract. A contract that is in breach is annulled. In other words, when a contract is broken, it's canceled. And the reason for that is because of the fairness of a contractual agreement. The fairness is the balance between the values, right? Well, the mistake that human beings make is to think that covenant is actually contract, okay? So let me explain. We would like to think that Israel was the party in the second part, that they were to deliver obedience to God as a result of God being their protector, etc., being their friend and being their husband, etc. And that when Israel broke that covenant, that the breach annulled the covenant. Okay? That's stupid head thinking. Okay? And when I say stupid head thinking, that's people thinking that a covenant is a contract. Now, the reason why this is so important is because foolishness can destroy you. My people perish for a lack of knowledge, right? Okay, so it is imperative that we then do what? We figure this out. Covenant has a greater and a lesser. Always. There will always be a lesser in a covenant. And the reason for this is because covenant is about covering. Let me explain. In ancient times, if a person conquered another person in battle, they received all of their possessions as a consideration, if you will, of a belief that they can be beaten, right? So it's not like today where we go and have a military skirmish, and during that military interaction, somebody gets a little bit of land and somebody gets a little bit of land. It would be like, since the Allies won the war, we get Germany. But that wasn't the case, right? Germany still was allowed to be a sovereign nation. They just had some new conditions that they had to live under. Okay. But in ancient times, we would have gotten Germany, right? In ancient times, the way it would win, and there's proof in this, if you look at the in between the lines explanation of what happened between Abraham and Chedorlaomer, right? Chedorlaomer is a king, right, of a city-state of about 10,000 people who allies with four other city-states of about 10,000 people, so about a 50,000-man army, and then goes and starts to just ransack Canaan, taking from Sodom, from Gomorrah, from Zeboim, from the Amorites, right? And as a result of that, there is obviously a taking of possession of everything. We know because why? Because when Abraham is giving tithe to Melchizedek, king of Sodom walks up and says, hey, you can have the goods, I just want the people back. Now, why did he say that to Abraham? And why did he meet Abraham in the Valley of the Kings? Because the Valley of the Kings was a parlay where kings came together and negotiated their wars before their wars were fought, gave terms, etc., etc. The premise then becomes that Sodom goes to Abraham and asks for his stuff back because Chedorlaomer took it, which means who was in possession of the promised land at the time when Abraham beat Chedorlaomer? Who was in possession of Sodom when God came down and said, I'm going to destroy it? Abraham. And so the reason why this is important is because now when we get into the idea of covenant, you can understand that there's a greater and a lesser, because in ancient times, if you were beaten in battle, you lost everything. And you became subservient to the entity who beat you. All of your property, all of your families, all of your possessions, all of your crops, all of your animals, etc., went to that conqueror. And so covenants were formed to receive covering or protection and authority so that you wouldn't go in and take possession of a land. So the premise is that the way this would work, if we were to try to kind of tweak it into today, is that let's say Austria, who was annexed by Germany, was to approach America and say, hey, if you guys protect us from Germany, then we will be your ally. But better yet, this will be your land. So the premise is that when you go into a covenant, my land becomes your land becomes my land. My weapons become your weapons, and your weapons become my weapons, to the extent that you will exchange your weapons belt. So now I take your blade, however superior or inferior it is, and you take my blade, however superior or inferior it is, and now that's how we're going to fight our battles, with each other's blades. Furthermore, an animal is split in two and laid upon a hill, and a trench is dug, and the blood from the animal runs down into the trench, and the two people walk through the trench with the blood on their feet, saying, if this covenant is ever violated, may heaven do so to us and more. In other words, that the blood, our blood, would run up into the ground that high as a result of us violating the covenant. But it does not annul the covenant. And furthermore, there's an understanding that the reason why you say that oath is because this side of the oath and this side of the oath are independent commitments and vows before God, not before each other. And so the point would be is that we would say, okay, you are your own entity, going to have your own responsibilities within this covenant, and you are your own entity and have your own responsibilities within this covenant, and never shall the two be obligated to the other, but instead are vowing before God. So I vow to do these things on behalf of my spouse. My spouse vows to do these things on behalf of me. However, it is obligated through heaven. And so the ratification of a covenant is about the final public acknowledgement and the final public knowledge that the consummation has occurred. Now, in ancient times, that was a very public announcement. And the announcement came through the blood of the virgin being on the cover of the couple who had come together. And it was shown by her family. Our family, we say, here's the proof that she was a virgin. And here's the proof she's not anymore. And therefore, the covenant is ratified. Okay? But during the ratification process, the covenant is read publicly before the people, and the people then have what? An opportunity to what? Bear witness to the promise that the bridegroom and the bride have made. Now, it was originally arranged by the two fathers. However, it was what? It was proposed as terms by the bridegroom to the bride. And that is very important. Now, like I said, there will always be a greater and always be a lesser. And the premise is that the lesser would need protection, provision, and instruction. So now let's say that Germany's coming to annex Austria, and Austria says, okay, America, what am I supposed to do? What do you want me to do? That's instruction. Okay, America, they've sieged us. We do not have relief. What are you going to do? We start doing airdrops to bring in food, right? And then finally, what? We need protection. And we start dropping paratroopers into Austria, and Austria never gets annexed. Now, we know that's not what happened, but that is an example of what it would be like, okay? And so in a weird sort of way, Austria would become American soil, but under the conditions of covenant. Okay, so now the premise is that now that we understand covenant, we understand ratification, now we need to get to betrothal. Okay? Because betrothal is about a proposition from a bridegroom to a bride after the Shidduchin has occurred. I'm going to explain that in a minute. And therefore, the bride is given an opportunity to examine the vows and to understand her terms. And if she accepts both, so she has to accept the promise from the bridegroom, and she has to accept her obligation. And the promise is the expectation that she's supposed to have for the bridegroom, and her terms are the expectation that the bridegroom has for her. And what happens is in all of this is that she, this is interesting, is the final sovereign authority. Final sovereign authority. Now, that seems to get a little bit skewed in the American Bible. The American Bible doesn't seem to indicate that the bride has a choice, but instead is obligated into the marriage, and that's actually not the case. There is a cup of wine that is offered to the bride in order for the bride to what? To accept the terms, to accept the loss of her willfulness, right? The loss of her liberty or sovereignty as just an entity and family member where her father is the only authority and she's able to move within the camp as a free or as a liberty of not being obligated to a covenant. Okay? And then the loss of her family. She's going to mourn the fact that if she drinks this cup, dunno, right? That she is not going to be in her father's house anymore. And then finally, of course, the scary part for a young virgin is that when she drinks this cup, she accepts that when the ratification occurs, conjugal rights will be given, right? And so there is a anticipation or maybe even a little bit of an anxiety about consummation, about intercourse. Okay, now the next part that's important to understand is that if the betrothal is about the sovereignty of the bride, who originally drew the gaze in the first place and who is a lesser in the covenant that is ratified, then we need to accept that there's something very powerful about this surrender. There's something very special about this choice. And so we honor it. We accept that never was a woman obligated in the legal sense of Torah. And that I stress that because it's very important for you to understand. There were wicked peoples about at the time of covenant and its powers. And so some people would just sell their bride or sell their daughter. Yep, go ahead. Here you go. Give me cow. There she is. Have fun. But in the Torah infused heart, that was not permitted. The bride had to make a choice. And here's the interesting thing about the choice. The choice had to be demonstrated through free will, which meant only she and only she could. And when I say only, I mean her father's say didn't matter anymore. It had to come down to her choice. Did she want this man? Did she want this man to come into her? Did she want to become submitted to this man, to become pregnant by this man? Did she want to become a homemaker with this man? With all of the liberties of Proverbs 31, but all of the obligations of childbearing. Right? Which shows you how powerful females really are. I mean, if you men who are in these struggling marriages would realize the spiritual super powerhouse that you have in your household, I think your marriage would become a little more balanced. Okay, so now when we get into the context of matchmaking, we understand that it does not begin with the sovereignty of the bride, does it? No, it does not. It begins between the two fathers. And the two fathers negotiate, and the dowry is proposed, which becomes a decision for the bride in the end, becomes a decision for the bride. She could even potentially say, you know what, I don't think I'm worth one donkey. I actually want my father to be paid 2 donkeys. And the negotiations would continue until finally terms were concluded, and she would decide whether to drink the cup or not. Okay, so in that sense, I think it's very important for you to understand that these 3 steps took time. Why? Because from the moment of betrothal, the next thing that happens is the 2 are separated. And the 2 are separated in such a way that he can't go to her house. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that there is actually a concept that they're probably going to encounter each other in the town. But they're to encounter each other as they were before the betrothal. So there's an intrigue here. The betrothal is actually a very public administration process, because every man in the town who is a bar mitzvah is obligated to know who is betrothed and who is not. And that would happen through a public acknowledgement or a public demonstration of the drinking of the cup. However, when we get into things like, for example, when we get into Adam and Eve, that's a very different story, isn't it? So do I accept that some people come up with their covenants and then they very secretly and privately decide those covenants and then ratify their covenants? Sure, I do accept that. Why? Because who am I to decide whether or not they had witnesses? Who am I to decide whether or not there is a protection? Let me give you an example. Abraham takes Sarah into Gerar. Abimelech, king of Gerar, takes Sarah because Abraham is deceptive in his explanation of what's going on. Now, here goes Abimelech to lay down and go to sleep at night, and the intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into something definable as God, right? And the Lord God said, "You are a dead man." Abimelech says, why? And he says, because that's a married woman. And he says, will you destroy a righteous nation for one man? And so the premise is that Abimelech did not know, but the supernatural let him know. Right? So you can understand then how 2 people could come together and form a promise with each other. And I'm telling you, there are multiple men who have come to me and confessed that this happened, and now they're in all this distress, and they think it's because they did this thing. And I'm like, okay, first of all, that's not how God works. Second of all, that's not how covenant works. And third of all, that's not how look, it was never about the public witness, as it were, except that men would need to know that she was betrothed. And the ratification would then be what? Except that men would know that this has turned into something where you are not even present in the marketplace alone with this woman. Right? Okay, so matchmaking, betrothal, and ratification are steps that are broken out into time. The matchmaking takes time. In fact, it's important to know that the matchmaking process begins with the bride drawing the gaze of the man, which means there would be what? A necessity to facilitate that possibility. Well, interestingly enough, of all times in Israel, that there would be a time in which that would be done. In other words, there would be an intentional public event to show off the beauty of the women who were not spoken for yet, and it was at Passover. It was in the springtime. It was in the beginning of months. So, what do we look at? We look at that a woman now knows that there's going to be a public event in which she's going to present herself and hopefully draw the gaze of a man who is eventually going to become her husband, right? Okay. So now the premise is that as that occurs, she has to prepare herself, to make herself ready, to demonstrate that she is the bride, right? That she is an acceptable bride. Because what's going to happen? The man's going to go, Dad, I want that one. The dad's going to go to the Shad Khan and say, well, what do you think? The Shad Khan's going to go, you know what? I think they would make a good couple. Let's contact the bride's father. Contact the bride's father. Hey, I would like to marry your son to my or your daughter to my son. The bride's father then says, you know what? I'll say that that's probably a loss of about 10 cattle. Okay, boom. There's that acceptance, right? But then now you go to the daughter and say, you're going to be married. I am. Yeah. Okay. Let's just say that we go with this thought process that they're forced into it. It really is something how Torah protects this. How Torah says that if a man seduces a woman, that he is to pay the dowry to the father. And here's the crazy part. If he changes his mind, doesn't want her, right? And here we go with like, you were at the tavern the night before and whoops, I didn't realize what I did last night. Too bad. You still have to pay the dowry even if you don't want her. That's insane too. Okay. So now the premise is what we really get our minds wrapped around is the concept that it goes from drawing the gaze to accepting the covenant. So how do we draw the gaze of the bridegroom? Well, we examine ourselves and beautify ourselves, right? We prepare ourselves. Okay, so now that means that preparation is a part of the Shidduchim. Now, let's break this down a little bit further in such a way that you could really understand this. So in the book of Revelation, we have a marriage supper of the Lamb, which is what? The ratification of the covenant. At Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2 and in Exodus chapter 19, we have the betrothal, or what we call the erusin, or the proposal to the bride. Now we have in Jeremiah chapter 31 through 33, we have what? We have the proof that he was a husband to them, right? Okay. So now we get to the choosing, or the Shidduchim, the drawing of the gaze and the discussion or negotiations. And of course, you guys understand that I am about to go into this direction with it. Passover is the season from here to here. Pentecost is the season from here to here. Okay? Tabernacles is the final season. So if we accept that these are broken up into three, these are the what? These are the mandatory feasts, or the feasts that are the pilgrimages, where you were to travel from where you lived in order to celebrate them. I'm going to put a different color up here to define this. This is the Shidduchim. This is the Erusin, and this is the Nezisim. Okay? I think there's actually two S's here. This is the Nezisim. So this is the matchmaking. This is the betrothal. And this is the ratification. Okay? Now, what's really, really important here is you need to understand that this is an entire season. This is an entire season, and this is an entire season. This is the season of matchmaking. Season of matchmaking. And this is the season of betrothal. Okay? So now we have something very interesting going on. Two very interesting points. Number one, we also understand, and let me go ahead and change the color now. We also understand that this is the season of the wilderness. This is the season of the golden calf. Okay? Now, this is the part that's important. There is a downward trend going this direction, a downward trend, and an upward trend. Okay? So we can call this section our weakness. And we can call this section our strength. Okay? Now, when we are working with this concept, it is very important to understand that the bride's weaknesses need to be augmented with beautification, right? Esther was put through a series of preparations to become the bride. And in those preparations, she was soaked in myrrh and in aloes and other things to beautify her. Well, that is to augment the things that may not have been desirable to see. Now, we know from the text that she was already very beautiful, right? But the point that I'm trying to make is that she had parts of her that needed to be augmented. All right, so let's explain how this works. How do you know that there is a defect? You look into a mirror, right? Because what wise woman would ever allow the other people in the room to tell her that there's a blemish? What level of mental dysfunction occurs when somebody makes a comment about a woman and her appearance in a group of people? Think about that just for a moment. Get your mind wrapped around that, because remember, that's a correspondence. That's a correspondence with the spirituality of the bride. How so? Because there is not a woman who will stand in front of a group of other people and they get to talk about the blemishes on her body. That doesn't work that way. So here's Paul saying the invisible attributes, the divine nature, and the eternal power of God are all defined in that which has been made. And here we have a female who refuses to accept the criticism of other human beings about her appearance. So how does she know about her appearance? She looks in the mirror. Okay? All right. Whew. This is absolutely essential to this season. You're going to see that in a minute. But what I want you to understand is our weaknesses are that blemish. Now, What about our strengths? Will a woman stand in front of others and allow herself to be admired? Oh, we have a very different nature now, don't we? Now, all of a sudden, I'm going to throw my hair back and I'm going to show my vulnerabilities. I'm going to expose my vulnerabilities, right? I'm going to show my neckline, right? I'm going to show my legs. I'm going to be beautiful as I was created to be in front of others in order for them to admire me, which means what? She becomes an influencer in her strengths. This is a private identification that is augmented through beautification practices, makeup, if you will. But this is a public administration, isn't it? They admire her beauty and she becomes an influencer upon that room. Her beauty affects everyone, man and woman alike, in that room. So now the gaze is being drawn. So you see, the season of Passover is about drawing the gaze and negotiating the betrothal, negotiating between the shadchan, the two fathers, and the bridegroom and the bride, right? Okay. So we see that Passover is the drawing of the gaze, right? Okay, so now let's talk a minute about the wilderness season, okay? So I'm going to do another illustration here with the same principles in place. Only we're just going to really quickly define them. You guys know this is going to end up being Passover. It always is, right? And those of you who are tired of this, I promise you, if you knew half of what I know, this would not be boring now. I promise you that I have just been giving you as much as I'm instructed to give you about the wisdom of these three feasts. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and let's just go ahead and create our timeline through here because we need to do something to this timeline. Now, you guys remember and you guys accept that the wilderness season is a decline in what? It's a decline in satiety. It's a decline in satisfaction, right? There is desire, and part of that desire has to do with fear. It has to do with certain other things, like hungers or deep, unsatisfiable hungers, I should call it, okay? Because I want you to think about this. What level of heart condition is present in a people who have a pillar of light by night and a pillar of smoke by day, or a pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, pillar of cloud by day? What level of what level of condition of the heart has to be present in order for somebody who has that in their presence to say, God brought us out here to die? Okay? Okay. Now, what's very important to understand is we've been given instruction in Torah to do something, right? So I think the way that I'm going to do this actually is I am going to try to get a hold of all this, which I was able to do, and I am actually going to stretch it out. Okay, so we lost the leg from Passover. That's interesting. Let's just go ahead and move that over there. There we go. Okay, so the reason I made this so big is because of what we have to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to make that a lot bigger. We're going to go way down here, okay? and we're going to go way up here. All right. And so the premise is that what we have in between Passover and Pentecost as a commandment in Torah is a counting. And I'm going to explain that a little bit better in a moment, but let's go ahead and mark out this counting. It is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can go ahead and split these up. Actually, no, that's incorrect. We would have to do it this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. All right. So in each of these 7 is an actual process that will be harmonic to the season. So I guess I need to probably explain harmony, but instead, I think right now, at the very least, we're just going to go ahead and connect these up the way they're supposed to be, which would be something like this. Okay? All right. Now, I need to explain something called tessellation here. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to really quick illustrate a line. So here's a line, okay? And that line is the shortest distance between 2 points, okay? Now, if I want to create halves of that line, I can then add points. Now the shortest distance between 2 points is actually 2 lines, okay? And so what we call that is a doubling, okay? Now right now we're halving, but I'll explain that. I'll explain in a minute what I mean by doubling. Okay, so we have the 2 halves here. If we wanted to double the size of the 2 halves, then we would obviously take let's see, let's go green. We would take this length and double it, right? Okay, so let's do that. We'll take this same exact length and we will double it. So I'm going to say that that then is going to be that much, okay? And now we have our point here and our point here. And then we're going to go big again, and we're going to go here. And now we have twice the amount that these are. So in the first instance, we halved it. In the second instance, we actually doubled it. So our first length is actually exactly doubled. This is called tessellation, and the best way I can explain it to you is that as you add points, you add possibilities of movement, and I'll explain that a little bit more, but the premise is that every point then becomes actually a segment of that process, okay? So the length from this point to this point is actually these 2 points. But we doubled it. Doubling is called octave. Now, before I lose you, the only thing I want you to understand is that there are octaves of frequencies that create higher pitched sounds in the same zone as the original. Now, getting back to this, then we can accept that these are not octaves, but are sevenths, right, of the Passover season. Now, altogether, there are 7 sevenths, right, plus 1 equals Pentecost, 50. Now, the reason why this is important is because you begin to understand that this season has been segmented by Torah up into sevenths plus one. And if we accept that there was at least 2 to 3 days, so let me explain that really quick. That's going to take a little bit of explaining because I don't want to confuse you. I don't want you to think that it goes from Passover to Pentecost for 50 days. It doesn't. There's only one instance in which that is actually possible, and that is if the Sabbath and Passover are together. And what I mean is the actual Sabbath, okay? So the premise is that Passover occurs, and then we wait until the next Sabbath, and on the next day after that Sabbath is the beginning of the counting of Omer. Now, the Jews will tell you, and the rabbis will tell you that no, it's actually counting from the Sabbath that is the Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread. I'm not going to contend with that. I practice it how I understand it, and what I understand is that it's going to be about Shabbats because we count from Shabbats. Okay, now having said that, here we go, and this is important. So you have Passover and you have the regular Sabbath, then that would be a 50-day period, which is more indicative of what actually happened at Sinai, because it says that it had been 50 days since the Passover when they arrived at Mount Sinai. Okay. So now what's important about this is for you to understand that those 50 days aren't just the season of Passover. There can be an entire week. Like, for example, if Passover falls on, say, Sunday, it's not until the next Sunday that the counting of Omer begins. And so what's important about that is to know that there's probably some extra days in there. However, from the counting of Omer, Passover season is cut into sevenths and 1 day. So let's talk about those sevenths because they are actually a tessellation, an uneven number, which is really significant, a tessellation of the wilderness season. Meaning what? The wilderness season, as overwhelming and destructive as it is actually chunked. In neurolinguistic programming and coaching, one of the things that we do for our clients is we will chunk overwhelming information into doable goals, right? Doable, achievable goals. And the premise behind it is that it makes it easier to get through that season, right? It makes it easier to get through whatever task it is that they're feeling overwhelmed with. And so, in principle, then, we know that there is going to be some sort of focus upon getting through the wilderness season, right? Okay, so the counting of the Omer then becomes about the examination of self, right? Okay, so I want to talk to you a minute about how this works. During the 40 days of introspection, from the first of the 6th month until Yom Kippur is 40 days. And during that time, we look deep into the depths of our darkness and shadow and hearts to identify what we need to take to Yom Kippur and say, I accept the consequences thereof. I repent and I want to turn from my wicked ways. If my people who are called by my name will seek my face, turn from their wicked ways and pray, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land, right? So when we are examining the truth of this process, we can accept that this is actually not only about drawing gaze, but this is about examination, but not in the sense of the 40 days of introspection. Let me explain. There is no Yom Kippur to the wilderness season. In fact, the wilderness season is the result of Yom Kippur. What does that then become? That then becomes a truth that the wilderness season has a very different kind of energy. Well, it's a powerful energy. Recall that the light of Passover has gone out from the point of Passover into the past, the lamb slain from the foundations of the earth, into the future, the marriage supper of the Lamb. Everything in between is just a diminishing light. Why? It's entropic. It entropies. It actually breaks down. Why? Because there needs to be a concealment of it in order for us who are what? Who are human, valuable, and not quite the intensification of all power in the universe. Definitely a dialed back version of him, because everything exists as a result of him, and therefore we are him. Is what? Is about us actually being that light. Okay. So last week we discussed some of the ramifications of that. We discussed kind of the premise of that our hindsight says that our fears, our hungers, and our thirsts will be satisfied, right? And all we have to do is accept the divine intervention. Manna was a divine intervention, which means what? It came from a higher heaven than the beating of the Amalekites. Water from the rock did not come from a higher heaven, but from a midsection between heaven and earth. And the attack of the Amalekites was in the valley, and therefore the attack of the Amalekites was on earth. And the prevailing over the Amalekites, or the overcoming of the fear of them, was about human effort. Joshua had to go back to the back of the group and protect the ones who were slow, because the Amalekites were what? They were taking advantage of the weaknesses. The weaknesses. Oh, that becomes important, because now what? We understand the weaknesses have to be what? Augmented through beautification. Okay, so now we understand that the weaknesses of the wilderness season are augmented through beautification, that as a result of a divine intervention. Your beautification will come through your divine intervention. The beautification of Israel, receiving a satiation of their hunger that could not be satisfied by even the very animals that they had with them, was manna. Okay, so we understand that the beautification of Israel, or the satisfaction of Israel, was about manna, right? And it says in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Let's go there, in fact, just because I would like you to see the context here. Okay, so let's see. We will go to the tablet. We're going to go specifically to Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And there's some very important words that you need to hear here. I'm going to go ahead and go NLT on these. Okay, remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes out of the mouth of the Lord. And you guys know from my teaching last week that temptation, maybe it wasn't last week, that temptation of Yeshua to change the rocks into bread would have been a direct violation of this commandment, because his satiety was not going to come from bread. It was not going to come from bread alone. It was going to come from manna. And that would have been a very different situation. And I propose to you that when the angels I propose to you that when the angels actually ministered to Yeshua, they did so via the via manna. They brought manna to Yeshua. I propose to you that that's what happened when they ministered to him. Okay. All right. So now the next section we need to get into is what happens during these chunked wilderness seasons. Each week actually is a wilderness season that requires a certain response because there's a certain amount of repair that is supposed to be going on. Let me explain what I mean. So last week I told you that however you count the Omer, find some attributes of God and meditate upon them and activate them through your behavior, right? But what I didn't tell you was actually what you were doing in that moment, okay? So in order to really actually get our minds wrapped around this, we're going to talk a little bit about the specific system that I use to do this examination and what it means and how it works. Okay, I and my congregation, because of course I end up sending out a daily instruction concerning it. Okay, so we need to get back to the board, and we need a new set here. So the best way that I'm going to put this to you is that we're just going to list some attributes here. We're going to list what should exist within us, right? So we're going to say loving kindness is an attribute, right, of God. And then we're going to say from loving kindness, we're going to go ahead and we're going to accept that another good one would be self-discipline. Okay. And another one would be, for lack of better words, let's just call it balance. Just weights and measures of that. Okay. Another one would be confidence. Another one would be humility. And then, of course, another good one could be, let's say, connection. Let's just call it connection. Connection. And then another attribute of God that would be important would definitely be leadership. Now, these are some pretty good attributes, aren't they? Well, what's interesting about it is these are 7. So we'll just go ahead and number them really quick. And I can explain then those 7 in an understanding. Okay, so this is number 1. This is number 2. This is number 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the principle would be in week 1 that we would examine ourselves concerning loving kindness. Okay, so during week 1, if we have those 7 Sabbaths that we are to count off, during that week, we would have the attribute of loving kindness. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. Let's say you go ahead and you use a different set, okay? This is the set I use. Let's say you use a different set to what? To meditate upon during these 7 weeks. Okay. So 7 weeks of 7 days, right? So each day would be some sort of meditation about loving kindness. Or if you used a different system, maybe some sort of meditation about compassion. Or maybe you get really weird and do some sort of meditation about, say, I don't know, a psalm, right? Or perhaps Ecclesiastes, right? But either way, you chunk it into these 49 days, okay? So the principle would be then, if you're in week 1, you would meditate on your first thing. So in this case, it's my first thing is loving kindness. So if that's the case, if I'm looking at loving kindness, let me tell you what I do not do. And this is very important for this season. I'm going to explain why in a minute. In loving kindness, I do not self-condemn. Okay? Let me go ahead and put one of them no smoking signs around this bad boy. I do not self-condemn. Okay? The reason why that's important, let's talk about this for a minute. Why do I do that? Am I leading up to Yom Kippur? No. I'm leading up to Pentecost. And what's the difference between the two? Yom Kippur, the books are open. We examine the works. The angels examine the works every Yom Kippur. The angels examine the works of every single last soul that is currently present in this realm. Okay? And they say, yep, okay, that person did that. And now here's the reciprocation of that. Whether it be something that is for the elevation of this realm, or whether it is for the descendants of this realm, the sinking down or the removing of energy from this realm, right? Or what the Bible would call sin. Okay, because for every sin we what? Lower ourselves away from heaven and earth and become more animalistic. And because of our obedience, we arise up towards heaven, mind the higher things, as Paul put it. We acknowledge a higher and more obedient self. It says that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Romans 8:4. And therefore, we understand that it is a higher self that actually directs our obedience. In fact, there are some obscure texts within the Jewish writings that say that the light of the Messiah is actually what gives us the ability to keep a mitzvah. Again, more obscure Jewish writings, not necessarily the mainstream public ones. Okay, so when we are looking at this concept, it is important for you to understand why we're looking in the mirror. Are we looking in the mirror to identify weaknesses? Do I look at loving kindness as a mirror and say, you know what? I fail so miserably at being a merciful or a loving kindness type of a person? No, I do not. Why? Because what am I preparing for? I'm preparing for the cup. Right? I'm preparing for the betrothal. I am preparing to commit my life to the bridegroom. Right? So what am I not doing? I am not identifying my blemishes. Why? Because in my blemishes, he is made strong. In my weaknesses, he is made strong. Manna is the only answer, and I can't put that makeup on. Right? Okay. And so something very different occurs. When I look in the mirror, I see the light of loving kindness on me. I recognize the light of my Messiah within me. I look and I say, that is beautiful. And how then do I do that? Remember the woman who stands in the room to be admired. I become that light. Proof that it was there in the first place, that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The death of the ego has already occurred. It's already present within me. And therefore, as I look into that light, I say, that is who I am. I see it in the mirror. The mirror reflects that I am the light. Yeshua said, you are the light of the world, but do I really believe it? No, not until I see it in me. So how do I see it in me? By proving or earning the light. Let me explain. So I look at loving kindness. For a whole week, I look at loving kindness. For a whole week, I study mercy. For a whole week, I say, this is actually what I am. I don't say, I wish I was that. That would be a lie. I would be lying to myself as I said, I wish that I had loving kindness, because I already do. Now, there's two things that are very, very important about that. It's important for you to understand that in order for energy to move, there has to be a conduit, right? Oh, but this gets interesting now, because now when we get into conduits, recall there is, and remember that day that I taught about conduits, I took upon myself a last name, which some people might question that I did that myself, but it was not as a thing of pride or title, but instead as a hope that I would become. When I said, my name, my Hebrew name, Kinatavnu, which was not my choice. I did not take that name. That name was given to me. My Hebrew name, Kinatavnu, and then added, I want the surname to be Ben Racham. I want my descendants to be called sons of compassion. I want myself to be known as a son or a student of compassion. Ben does not necessarily mean son in the sense of progeny, but instead of training, right? I want to train in compassion. Why? Because that is how energy moves. Energy moves as a result of compassion. Let me demonstrate. Okay, so let's go jump to the board real quick so I can demonstrate this. So let's say that let's just draw this thing here. Let's just say that I am a pitcher, right? And this here pitcher is full of water, right? Okay. And there is then some other thing present, right? That is something that is lesser than me, right? And that particular lesser is devoid of water. Now it is my responsibility to what? To give water to that lesser. Why? Because if I do not, then I am denying my own blessing of reciprocation through elevation. In other words, the only way in which I can become greater than I am now, which means I can equally distribute to more lessers, is through the process of compassion. The process of compassion is a conduit between the greater and lesser. The greater will have compassion upon the lesser, and the resultant will be what? The resultant will be a transference of energy, which consequently in this case is actually water. Okay, so now as that is pouring into the other, there's a reduction on my side and an increase on their side. Therefore, I am changing their status. So their status is being elevated and my status is being diminished. Remember what John said? I must diminish that he can, must decrease that he can increase. Oops, I put that backwards. Yoink. There we go. Down. There we go. All right. Now, does that result in anything important? Yes, it does, because I had to get underneath. That was weird. I had to get underneath to elevate this vessel, right? Through compassion. The energy came through me to it by me getting underneath it and elevating its status above mine. It says, mind not high things, but condescend to men of lower estate, right? That's what it says. So now I get underneath, raise up, and as I raise up, status changes on both sides. Now, what's important about this is you need to know that if I am a vessel full of energy over here, let's just say this really quick. So I am a vessel full of satisfaction. And this is a vessel full of what? Hunger. Okay? And if you accept this, the only way in which I can have compassion is if I am not caught up in my ego and not caught up in my mess, and therefore I am what? At that moment, and this is important, let's see, what color do I want to put this? I actually want to put this in some like royal purple or something. Let's see how that works out on the board. I want to be what? Strong mind, right? Mind. Strong mind. Okay? And the vessel, unfortunately, will probably be and I'm going to put this in an important color too. Let's see, what can we put it in to illustrate this? How about something very dry looking? Twisted mind. Ming again, that's fine. Mind. Okay. What has happened here? I already contain loving kindness. How do I prove that? By it flowing out of me into a vessel that needs or is hungry for loving kindness. And what? The opportunity to actually emanate loving kindness will be through a vessel who has that need, right? Now, you recall that Yeshua said you will always have the poor with you, but then he also said that the poor are him. Unto the least of these, if you do it, you have done it to me. You say, I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick or I was in prison, you comforted me. I was sick and you visited me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was cold and you gave me your coat. Lord, when did we do all these things? And unto the least of these you have done it, then you have done it to me. Meaning what? Meaning you have changed my status from what? Becoming the lowest of the low, elevating me back into my kingship. Right? He did not find it robbery to be equal with God, but instead left his estate, emptied himself, right? Took on the form of man. And it says he is the image of the invisible God. And so we accept that whatever's going on here is about some sort of elevation that's supposed to occur. Okay, now this is where it gets bigger. Okay, this is where it gets bigger. Because what is this? This is the beautification process through what? Through our strength, right? Through our strength is that we actually make the actual actionable effort to offer loving kindness through the changing of status of a weaker vessel. Okay? The weaker vessel having some sort of wound, entitlement, or limiting belief. Right? And a lack of imagination, obviously, because all of those things are augmented by our imagination. So, as we elevate financial status, emotional status, spiritual status, cognitive status, some people who are mentally ill just need to have a moment of this light poured into them, right? Mental status. As we augment those five things and show beautification, we are demonstrating that we are actually the makeup for the blemishes that are the bride. In other words, that divine intervention I was talking about earlier, where the manna is coming, had to have been the result of an action. Somehow, manna came because somebody had compassion and wanted the people to be fed instead of wiped out by a plague. Fair? Okay. So now what's important from that is then as I look into the mirror, I am not looking for the failures. I am not looking for the mistakes during the wilderness season. Why? Because what is the wilderness season actually going to do? It is going to do the complete opposite of that for me. I am the one who's going to have the desires that would need that, right? And so you need to understand that as a human being, as you go through the wilderness season and you have your hungers, they're going to be satisfied by something divine. But what's interesting is it's actually humans who have to have compassion upon them. You see, it was a human who had compassion upon humans that caused Noah to be able to be preserved in the ark. It was not just God saying, I better save somebody. I better keep at least a little bit of humans around. That's not how it worked. Somebody had compassion. And I propose to you that Yeshua was the ultimate compassion. I propose to you that he demonstrated that this entire world is worth saving. You want proof on this? Watch this now, and this is important. He says he came for the sick. He says he came for the lost. He says he didn't come for the healthy. He did not come for the people who did not need him. He came for those who needed him. Oh, but this is very powerful, isn't it? Because those who need him are also the ones who bring about the apocalypse because of their behavior. Oh man, it gets even worse, doesn't it? Because now what we can say is either A, the world is savable and that's why he died, or B, oh wait, there isn't a B. His death proclaims that people are what? Worth it. Worth it. Oh, now, but watch this. In the Greek and in the English, we do not find the bride in Revelation to be plural. Do we? No, we do not. Now, in another place in Ephesians, it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So the bride being discussed here is not your wife per se, but instead this bride, which is the church, right? Which is consequently is just the assembly of those who are in covenant, which consequently the word assembly is used at the covenant with Israel in Exodus chapter 19, where the multitude accepts the covenant. Sorry, not Acts chapter 19, Exodus 19. Okay, So now, when we are working with this model, something very apparent occurs. As one of us meditates upon an attribute of the intensification of all power in the universe, and then in meditating upon that attribute, actually begins to carry out that attribute, they bring down the light into the world to elevate it. However, can one man do that? Well, no. Interestingly enough, it says if Noah, Daniel, and Job were present in a land, this is in Ezekiel, I believe, chapter 12. If Noah, Daniel, and Job were present in a land, and I brought a sword against that land, I would not save that land for their sakes. I would get them out of there and destroy the land. So what does that mean? That means one man cannot necessarily save a nation, right? Oh, but what about Yeshua? Well, that's a little bit different story, right? So what are we working with here? We're working with the idea that it is actually a corporate collective consciousness that can actually elevate a land. Well, how many does that take? Well, according to the negotiation between Abraham and Yahweh concerning Sodom and Gomorrah, 10. 10 men can save a city. So those 10 men have to be elevated, strong minds, with compassion, full of energy. That's some criteria. So what do we need first? We need to not be in our wounds, entitlements, and limiting beliefs. We need to have an active imagination. And so that's what gets rid of the twisted head, right? That's what gets rid of the twisted mind, which makes you a strong mind, which consequently is the light or the energy that is necessary. And therefore, the will or compassion to move that energy, regardless of merit, because what do we need to do? We need to look and say, we have compassion on that thing, even if it is evil, right? Okay. So we need to have the energy present, be filled, which according to our identity already exists because the righteousness of God is an equal distribution of abundance. You have to have abundance before you can distribute it. Therefore, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. An equal distribution of the light means you already have the light to distribute it. And therefore, when I look in the mirror during the wilderness season, during the counting of Omer, I identify that that energy is already present. But then I have to have compassion upon the vessel who needs the energy, who obviously is not a strong mind. And so they're going to be what? Nasty. They're going to be mean, and they're going to be bitter, and they're going to have hatred, and they're going to have anguish, and they're going to have guilt, and they're going to have anxiety. And that is actually what I need to pour into. Now, the next thing that is important about this is in that process, then I need to also understand it is going to diminish my status. So there's a loss. There's a cost, right? Yeshua said he felt the dunamis go out of him, right? Something changed in his status. Now, once we get into that thought process, then we need to accept that 10 men can save a city. They need to all have strong minds, have the energy and the compassion to move the energy in the first place. Now, if that occurs, then a city will be saved. But I propose to you that it is actually a reflection of the corporate collective conscience. There's this interesting thing about reflected light. In fact, in general, it's Hertzian energy at all and its reflections that is really interesting. For example, when we get into acoustics, when we get into photography, when we get into astronomy that requires telescopes to catch light and reflect it in a parabolic system. Radar, LIDAR, sonar are all about reflected systems of Hertzian energy. When we get into the action of reflection, we need to accept that there are angles involved and therefore geometry involved, which means in some sort of way, we need to understand that there are other things at work here. So let's talk about this in terms of convergence, okay? In terms of convergence, two very important things that we need to discuss. The first thing that we need to discuss is that if two lines are going out from each other, this is called divergence. Okay? There is a very important purpose behind divergence. Then if we have two lines coming in, right, that is convergence. Now, convergence versus divergence have to do with intersecting points. If I have a line and along that line, I draw a circle or create a cycle, which means what? Which means there's vibration. And in that process, I create another circle that is of the same, sorry, let me do this a little bit different. Another circle that's of the same frequency or vibration, right? Then there is actually, interestingly enough, a line that connects the two intersecting points of the circle that is called the, one of these days I'm gonna get my pen straight, perpendicular or convergent line. Now, the reason this is important is because there's something else that's about to occur here, and that is that there's going to be an influence upon this system. So two very important elements that we need to get into. The first is that if two lines are intersecting, there is a point of intersection, which we're going to paint green here, okay? And then I'm going to label all of my stuff. Because why? Because this is actually a very, very important concept in sacred geometry. So the way that I want you to think about this is a line of energy. Okay? A line of energy. This is also a line of energy. Let's change the color so that we don't. This is also a line of energy. Now, it is important to understand that one of these is the greater and one of these is the lesser, and we'll understand that in a minute. Now, what is the point behind vibration is that there's a making of sound. Now, let me express something very important here. In the making of sound, that can be speech, because all speech is music with stops, with rests, okay? When we sing to each other, we are actually going wow, wow, with what? With stops. ST is an example of a stops, right? There's a stop there before there's a vowel. Those vowels within an open mouth or a wide mouth or a rectangular mouth change the sound and frequency, and therefore words actually end up being different vibrations. But this is just one instance of music. There are furthermore other instances of music there. For example, within our body language, we actually are emitting frequencies. Now, I know that sounds a little bit off the wall, but it's true. Finally, there is, of course, the concept of true music, but again, this is all just sound. Sound is between about 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, right? Or 20 kilohertz. Now, what's important about that, in fact, we're going to go ahead and put that up here for a minute. We're going to talk a minute about the spectrums, okay? Oh, let's see. Let's just go ahead and label this stuff in this color here. So the first spectrum is from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Okay? That is a vibration. That is a frequency. This is sound. And then we get up to about, I believe, the next level is actually going to be in the megahertz, and it's going to be, I think it's like 49 gigahertz, I believe it is. 49 gigahertz is where light begins. I might be off on that. So don't quote me on that. And it's not all that important to this discussion. And then I can't remember where it comes out at, but it's like 129, I believe, gigahertz over here is actually light. And between these ones, there's actually another frequency vibration set spectrum of oil, but we're not going to necessarily get into that today. So we'll just leave a question mark there. Sound, light, and oil kind of make up the spectrums of frequency experience. And I mean essential oils. All right. Now, the reason why I put those on the board is to kind of give you an idea that sound and light and other energies are all within the same category of vibration. Okay, so when I talk about vibration here, what I'm talking about is basically that there's some sort of cycle that has begun and therefore has created a vibration. Now, when we're talking about vibes of a human, you walk into a room and you sit down with somebody and they start putting off these negative vibes, right? There's just this feeling of discomfort. That is all part of what we're talking about here, and most likely there's a divergent energy going on there, and I'll explain that in a minute. But you notice as these vibrations are occurring, which consequently have something to do with harmony, which I'll explain in a minute, the principle is that all harmony is vibrations that get along with each other and don't create problems, okay? That's all that means. So you can have something that vibrates at this frequency, something that vibrates at this frequency, and they clash with each other. And then you can have something that vibrates at this frequency and something that vibrates at this frequency, and they actually get along with each other, okay? All right, so now what we have in this perpendicular line is an intersection. So let's go ahead and label that as well. We'll just keep the same color we've got right now. This is an intersection. And one of the things you need to know about intersections are about purpose. And don't worry, I'm going to actually put this back up on the board here in a minute. I just want to talk a minute about intersections. Intersections are encounters between two souls, between two energies. And strange things happen when energies come together, okay? Odd things happen. But what you need to understand is that a lot of times there is an intention behind it. Let me explain this to you. An intersection is always going to result in two systems passing by each other, intersecting each other, and then continuing. There isn't actually a stopping of those two energies. They encounter each other, they interact, and something happens. For example, when a Higgs boson interacts with the boson field, with the Higgs field, then all of a sudden matter comes into existence through mass, right? And so the premise is that quantum energies actually take upon themselves material realm systems, right? Okay, and so what I want you to think about is that your system is not any more important than another person's system, but when they encounter each other, they interact. We've seen that with two galaxies coming together, and the mess that makes. So the reason why this is so important is because what I want you to understand is that convergent energies actually have attraction. Divergent energies do not have attraction. There's a reason why something's leaving your life, and there's a reason why things are coming into your life. And I can tell you right now, if all good things come down from the Father of Lights, if something intersects with your life, most likely you need to understand that it is to benefit both you and the thing that intersected your life, not just you. Okay? One of the most signature elements of convergence will always be coincidence. I don't think I'm spelling this right, but who cares? Coincidence. And the principle behind coincidence is that you will have something in common. I grew up in this town. Oh, I did too. Pay attention. I have this number in my bank account. Oh, I do too. Pay attention, right? It is very important for you to understand that convergences don't necessarily equate to what you think their purpose is, but instead what their purpose is. So convergence will always be the result of some sort of attraction. Well, let's get back to our thought process on the context of a lesser. In other words, a lesser is going to actually be drawn into your life in order for you to elevate them. We don't know how, but that's not the purpose here. Identifying that lesser and having compassion on them and intentionally moving energy upon them. Oh man, if you understood the dynamic there, if you understood that you were actually given a strong mind, the energy, and have the compassion, and you're just putting it out to that singular intersection, if at least 10 of us do it, the entire city is saved regardless of their behavior. It is difficult to have compassion upon a world who is so cruel, so manipulative, so stuck in their wounds, so caught up in these entitlements, and so foolishly dependent on a belief that they are limited in what they can do. I don't know how many times a week I encounter a time waster. Someone who does not ever benefit from the light that I give them because they will not release from it. So I propose to you two very important elements then of the wilderness season. The first is to understand that divine intervention is the result of somebody having compassion upon this world. The second is to understand that the divine intervention is a beautification of the bride. The third is to understand that those insatiable desires during the wilderness season are designed for you to want to be beautified. The fourth is that if you are in a state of strength, of a strong mind, that you're not caught up in your wounds, you're not caught up in your entitlements, you're not caught up in your limiting beliefs, and you have an active imagination, then you yourself can what? Actually be the one to have the compassion, actually bring the light down from above in order to elevate. Right? Okay. So now you understand that there's a dynamic here between your human will and strengths and the intensification of all power in the universe's limitless energies. Okay? And then you kind of figure out that they're kind of one and the same. Okay. So now, if we go back to, well, I actually said I was going to put this here, so I'm going to talk about this from this point of view. What vibration is actually occurring here? Many times it is speech. Right? Okay, spelled speech wrong. That's okay though. Speech. And it's important in speech to, or I'm sorry, I'm trying to spell speak here because it's in action. So vibration is about speak, right? Which is actually song, right? So we're singing to each other. And the context is that will eventually attract the lesser to you in order for you to lose your status. Well, that sounds about as backwards as it could possibly be, but I want to propose to you that you need to recall the wilderness season is the result of your behavior that was determined, that was examined and was determined to have a resultant at Yom Kippur. The wilderness season is your reaping what you've sown, but here's the interesting thing about it. The wilderness season gives you an opportunity to tikkun olam, to repair the breach, to repair the world, but it does not accept one person's effort. And so I propose to you that some of you just need to wake up, get healed, and start elevating the world, or we're going to have a big problem. Because guess what? Not to sound prideful, but I'll just be moved away from this city and this city will be destroyed. Because I've chosen to be a strong mind. I've chosen to push through the breach, right? Not the breach, to push through the limitation. And because I chose to push through the limitation into what? To actually action the light of the Messiah, which is the light of Passover, which is the result of the soul of Torah having compassion upon the lower worlds, I become that conduit. Does it mean that I'm still got owies or that I don't have owies anymore? No, I've got owies. I've got idiosyncrasies tied up into wounds that will drive you crazy if you hung out with me. But my intention to activate the light is not a try. It's not an attempt. So what does convergence and divergence tell us? Convergence and divergence offers us an opportunity to open up. Now let me explain to you what I mean. Let's say that you have prayed for guidance on how to serve God. You're a Christian. You've heard the messages. You believe that you're in a state where you could potentially be of service to Him, and therefore you pray. What do you think is actually going to happen? Well, I can tell you it's going to work like this. You are going to be presented with something that is so off the wall from what you have already been trying to do that you will say these words. Only God could do something like that. Right? Only God could fix that. Only God could do this thing. I promise you that was the communication. That was the guidance you were seeking. Because what you need to understand is that when Yahweh told the earth to bring forth the beast of the field, and then Yahweh brought the animals to Adam to be named, only God can bring forth the beast of the field. In other words, there is a task to be accomplished that has nothing to do with your ability, but instead your willingness. Why? Because the entire universe was created in a thought from a consciousness that does not use physical processes to make things. That's what we do. We go find some iron and we go find some tin and we go find some copper, and all of a sudden we've got steel or bronze or something like that. Anyways, and all of a sudden we've got a usable, malleable metal that can be shaped into things to be used as tools, weapons, whatever. So now what we understand then is that you pray for guidance, right? You say, I need guidance. And then all of a sudden something comes your way that needs you to do something for it that you can't do. I promise you that was the guidance. Okay? But now here's the crazy part. People believe that if they open themselves up to the universe, that somehow they're going to be influenced by darkness in such a way that they might be deceived, and therefore now they would go down a dark path. So you're going to ask the intensification of all power in the universe. You're going to send a prayer up all the way up the chain. You're not sending the prayer to the first level where they just, give you some extra cash or whatever. You're asking for the big one, right? You say, I want guidance. I want you to show me how to do the things that I can't do, which would be what? Things that you can do, you as being the intensification of all power in the universe. So now I'm talking to the intensification of all power in the universe. I say, I want you to guide me. I open myself to that. Christianity teaches that if you open yourself to that, you are putting yourself in danger of being deceived. But here's the crazy part about this, is when you open yourself to that, you are trusting the intensification of all power in the universe. Is he going to prove himself as untrustworthy? No, he is not. However, it is very important for you to understand that everybody and their mama is going to offer you guidance. And what you need to do is understand that you can trust the prayer that you prayed, which means what? You open yourself. Let me tell you what happens when you open yourself. What happens? You attract the vessels. It's very important for you to understand. You just sit there and the vessels come to you. You go through your life doing what you do with life, and the vessels come to you to be poured into. And usually they're a hot mess. Okay? But the principle is this is how you activate this energy of this time in these days. Is through a meditation and belief on some attribute of God. Realizing that meditation and belief is actually your light reflected in the mirror. Now, this is difficult because most people would say, oh, wait, that's pride. But the truth be told is that you were told that you were the light. So if you don't see that light in the mirror, then you are probably wounded still. Right? He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Look in the mirror and see the righteousness of God and prove it through action. of what? Pouring into and therefore losing status in order for someone else to gain status. Well, this sounds like a Messiah to me. This sounds like Yeshua. If Christ be in you, right? If the Messiah be in you, you see my point here. Okay. So the idea is then as you actually reflect that light, pouring into another, demonstrating that you are the thing that I've been trying to tell you that you are, not only does your breaches that were recorded and then examined at Yom Kippur become repaired, right, where you pay back what you stole, which would be energy, right? Or if we need to get into the technicalities, we could say what you stole money-wise or what you stole mentally from another to pay back what you stole, right? And in the process, elevate this world by being a corporate collective consciousness of elevation. You are actually demonstrating your bridal beauty and will draw the gaze of the king who has a very big interest in entering into covenant with you, right? After the Shidduchin season, right? After the season of matchmaking, counting the Omer, matchmaking, drawing the gaze, demonstrating compassion, and thereby moving energy, losing energy in order to gain more energy, raising the status of another in order for there to be a reciprocation of elevation. You understand now you are the earth that needs elevated. And in all of this, you are the twisted mind and the wounded heart that needs healed. You are the mind and the wounded heart that needs elevated in the first place. So there's an amazing revelation that comes in the form of saying, I understand now that the compassion that needs to be had actually needs to be had on myself. Love your neighbor as yourself. So all this that I just taught you, and the vessel that needs to be elevated, the energy that needs to be poured out, is all contained within you, because once you become that healed vessel, and you go from being a weak mind to a strong mind, it's time to activate. And that activation will then be effective to others. So what's crazy about this is, yes, Yeshua's death was on your behalf, but it's only the result of a compassion that you have on yourself to save yourself from the destruction of reciprocation from the wounds that are contained within your heart. Oh my gosh, does this get crazy? You want to go pass out tracks? The first track you need to read is your own. Or the first track you need to pass out is yours, and you need to read it. Understand that this begins with you seeing light in the mirror, pouring it into yourself through self-care, through loving that beautiful thing that was created. Do you see that principle here? You don't look in the mirror and see the failures. You see the light. Light that you first receive. Because the only way in which to be that thing that pours out is to receive it first. Don't think you start with a full picture on game day. On game day, you start with an empty pitcher and you allow yourself to understand that you're that light, and that's when that pitcher is full. It's the difference between believing that you are that thing and you are not that thing, and that's it. That's how it gets filled. So compassion on yourself begins the process. And then as that compassion on yourself occurs, you find it recognizable that there should be compassion on others. So here's the amazing thing. What actually saves the city? The compassion you have on yourself. Because then people become worthy of love. If you're worthy of love, then other people are worthy of love. If you're loathed, then why would you love another? If you're undesirable, if you're detestable, if you're ugly, then so are they. Because truth be told, they're going to want to try to give to you. And if you're not worthy of it and don't receive it, then what business have you of trying to repair the universe in the first place? A breach which you created in the first place. Oh my gosh, how deep does this go into self? Into idea of how you view yourself is what actually creates the repair. It's crazy. When it says love your neighbor as yourself, it's talking about vengeance. Do you know that that Torah commandment is talking about vengeance? Don't take vengeance in your own hands, but love your neighbor as yourself, right? That's the principle there. Let's go read it, actually. In Leviticus chapter 19. Same place tells you don't get tattoos, right? All right, here we go. Leviticus 19. I'm trying to see where to start. It's not that I haven't found it. I'm just trying to see if there's some context we could put in here. Leviticus, well, okay. This is what I'm going to do. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. Do not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is threatened. I am Yahweh. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Confront people directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. And then do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So, you now walk around and carry your guilt, right? You now walk around and you bear your failures. You walk around and you bear your ugliness during the wilderness season because you didn't respond to it correctly. You don't understand that reciprocation is playing a role here. But there's something else occurring, and I'm going to get to that point in a minute. But the premise is that it is very, very important for you to understand that it is actually your self-loathing that initiated the judgments in the first place, because you're calling them to yourself because you actually are the judge. You see, you will gladly appoint yourself judge of another. You will say, oh, yes, I see that behavior. Oh, yes, Torah says that person should not be doing that. And not only should that person not be doing that, but here's the punishment. I believe that that's the reciprocation that should fall upon them. You don't realize the moment that you have appointed yourself as judge, you did that, period. And so now you say, oh man, I'm such a horrible person. I don't deserve this. Check that box, because guess what? Now you don't get it. It's that simple, and it's that scary. Do you understand the level of light you need to see yourself in? You need to see yourself in your own light in the mirror activate it upon yourself first, and then you will be ready. You'll be ready to take that hit to your status as the others elevated, and you will be ready to what? Accept that the only way this world is going to be saved. Look, Yeshua died so that this world would be saved, not so that it would be destroyed. Or that's a really good waste of time, isn't it? And energy and owies. Because he had a lot of owies. Right? And so if we accept that he did that and then tells the disciples to go make disciples, we're supposed to be doing something here, and it is not about going and passing out tracts in front of a bar where you judge everyone. But instead, where you yourself take one tract, sit down in the chair, read it, and realize that's about you. You say, oh, wait a minute, I'm saved. Okay, fine. If you are, then why are you not worthy of the thing, or that you don't deserve the thing? Right? Okay, so you understand now that this has to start at home. But now I'm going to throw one other wrench in these works, and I'm sorry this one's a little bit long. And that is that you need to understand that this is not tied into Yom Kippur. And when I say you need to understand that, what you need to understand is that this is non-Hertzian energy. This is a very different kind of energy. This is a kind of energy that goes out. You grab it, receive it, wield it, and do something to the universe with it. But you need to understand, Yom Kippur does not exist during this season. This is not the sowing season. This is the reaping season. And responses are reciprocated immediately. Oh, if you understood that. If you understood that your responses to the reciprocations from Yom Kippur, which is a temporal process, are now activated in an eternal process. Why do I say that? Because the eternal process does not recognize the time cycle. You say, how's that possible? Well, here goes, and this is very important. If you don't see yourself in the light that I'm talking about, if you don't look in the mirror and say, there's light there, and I'm going to prove it by activating it, then the opposite is going to happen. So let me explain how this works. In my meditation of loving kindness, right, I'm using that list that I showed you earlier. In fact, I'll go ahead and put those behind me so that we have a context. If I have loving kindness, and there is a vessel needing loving kindness, and I am too busy in the wilderness season to realize and be willing to activate. Let me tell you how bitter you become during this season. The ridiculousness of bitterness and a lack of willingness to activate the light in this season. So if I deny this light within myself by either A, saying, oh, no, there's a jerk in the mirror, or better yet, B, saying that that person doesn't deserve the light, then what killed the firstborn becomes the energy in that moment. And what I mean by that is just as much as you can earn the light, and just as much as you can activate the light of Passover that has been concealed through the wilderness season. The wilderness season does not look like the light of Passover, does it? No. They come out of Egypt and all of a sudden they don't have food. I want you to think about when you don't have food, how hangry you become. Or better yet, the big one is thirst. Let me tell you, I always end up hiking in the desert and not bringing enough water. It's almost as if I am constantly in a state of activating the truth of the wilderness season. And so the premise is by the end, I'm parched, I've got the headache, I've got the things, right? And I'm sitting in the car on the way home, loving the hike, but thinking to myself, boy, did I just run out of water, right? They ran out of water, they ran out of food, and they were scared. It was scary. You need to have compassion on that. And perhaps maybe it's your compassion that brings them the manna. I don't even want to get into that. That gets into all kinds of temporal stuff and time stuff. But the premise is that the way that I want you to understand this is that if you deny this through either examination and tell a lie and say you're not those things, or you deny the vessel that it's supposed to pour into, it will turn on you. And all of a sudden, you will not have loving kindness as part of your process in the wilderness season. And you will end up being the twisted mind at the end of this thing that needs poured into, that needs healed, that needs fixed. It's scary. This is a very scary season because you need to understand the things you do now don't carry over into Yom Kippur. They carry into the moment. So do everything you can to daily meditate upon an attribute of the intensification of all power in the universe. Activate it first upon yourself, then upon those who need it, by having compassion first upon yourself, by giving yourself the long and deserved break that you have been deserving for a long time and saying, I did the best I could. And telling yourself, stop condemning me. Stop judging me. Stop accusing me. Because I am the light of Passover in the form of loving kindness. Oh my gosh, if we really could get our minds wrapped around this, and if there were 10 men, then this city would not be under judgment. And if there were 10 cities, this land would not be under judgment. But it is under judgment, and you know that you're experiencing judgment right now. You know, as you sit and watch your political views just get burnt up and crumbled by what you thought things were going to be versus what they were, whether it was the past 4 years or it's the next 4 years, you now know you're under judgment. It's because there were not 10 men who were willing to do what I'm talking about during this time. Now, as we move from Passover to Pentecost, recall there is a movement here. Let's see, how do we do this? I am just going to, oh, that's not right. That's not the right screen. There we go. I am just going to go ahead and do my normal illustration of the spiritual elevation of this season, the decline at Pentecost, and then the return or increase back to tabernacles. And here's the part that's crazy about it, and this is the part that's important, is you need to understand that the wilderness season, which is that which is contained within, let's do this color, that which is contained within this system is all about reciprocation and judgment. Then you will understand better that as there is a spiritual humility or decline here, I'm not going to do that color. When there is a spiritual humility and decline, let's see, so there would be a spiritual increase here, right? That climaxes and then descends back into more of a mortal process here. And then there is a continued descendance or a continued descent into the golden calf season as spiritual humility. We see then what? the incline back towards tabernacles as being another spiritual elevation. And it is very important for you to understand that if you do not do this correctly, then there is a system in place that is going to reciprocate that almost instantaneously, and that this is a very different concept than what we have going on with Yom Kippur. Why? Because it is a non-entropic energy. But as you'll notice in this process, that as we move away from Passover, that there is an incline in the physical willfulness of man that occurs. It returns around the fall feasts, but this incline right here is where the golden calf is built. And so as the light of Passover gets further and further away from its origin, the temporalness of reality begins to reassert itself. And we get back into Hertzian energies instead of non-Hertzian energies that have an instantaneous effect. So, I know some of that can sound really confusing and frustrating, and I know that there's a lot of things that happen during the wilderness season that are very confusing and frustrating, because sometimes part of the wilderness season will be an abundance given to you because you will squander it so that the judgment can turn around and squander you. That could be very confusing when I'm telling you you're hungry and all of a sudden all this money's coming in. But you don't realize that hunger is still there, it never satisfied, and you're going to have this attitude about it. That you're going to have this ungratefulness about it. It says, while the meat was yet between their teeth, the anger of Yahweh flared, and they had a plague among them. And so it's very important for you to understand there's an instantaneous element here. There's something very important about this process. Okay? All right. So what are the things? The things are, number one, you have 7 sevens to get this figured out. As you move from the beginning of the light of Passover outward towards Pentecost, it becomes more about your strength and not your weaknesses. The manna is coming, the water is coming, and you do not need to be afraid of the Amalekites because they're about to get their butts kicked by Joshua. I will remind you that the name Joshua means destroyer watches, right? And the principle behind it is that I'm going to destroy the wolf. I'm going to crush the skull of the wolf and take the lamb out of its mouth. That's the principle. The light of the Messiah is the light of Passover, is your light, is the light within you. When he said you're the light of the world, you need to understand that when he said that, he was talking about himself within you. Okay? Your best self is him. Your best self is Yahweh. Okay? And since your best self is Yahweh, and you absolutely need that guidance, it is a good idea to listen to those intuitions. Those intuitions are going to guide you by what? Something presenting itself to be poured into. At which point in time, you need to go through that process of giving to yourself first and then giving to the thing. If you do not, then it will reciprocate on you in a very uncomfortable manner. That is the power behind the wilderness season. When I first learned about the wilderness season and began studying it and trying to understand it, and did not really get the concept of it, except that I knew that this season was a big old pain in my neck. I had no idea the level of elevation that is possible in these moments leading up to Pentecost. The ability to raise this entire earth, if it were possible. It begins with one. One willing to do the same thing as the other turns into 10. 10 turns into a city not lost, where the pillar of light resides. Shabbat shalom.